Today, we'll be answering a question we've gotten a lot. What's the deal with Pittsburgh's H? What would eventually become the city of Pittsburgh was first named by General John Forbes in 1758, in letters that he had written describing his victory over the French during the 7 Years' War. The war was a truly barbaric one, with several towns and settlements across the continent being subjected to pillaging, destruction, and even cannibalism in some instances. So stay tuned to the channel if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But for now, the important piece to this story is that the English forces were eventually able to claim the forks of the river as their own, and colonists christened the new fort and its new town after William Pitt the Elder, who was beloved across the British Empire as this working-class everyman of British Parliament, before his charm and political savvy allowed him to climb the ranks of government, becoming the Secretary of State, largely responsible for overseeing British strategy during the 7 Years' War. General John Forbes, originally being from Scotland, named this new town Pittsburgh, pronounced and spelled like the city of Edinburgh in his homeland. The town of Pittsburgh, for most of its early days, was spelled with an H in newspapers and official documents, signifying that this was a common spelling and pronunciation of the town used by its early residents, most of whom were veterans of the 7 Years' War and later the American Revolution. Pittsburgh's H, however, was noticeably missing a few years later from a Pennsylvania Commonwealth City Charter in 1816, being written as Pittsburgh. Throughout the 1800s, the population of Pittsburgh began to change, and what was once a town largely of veterans and a few Native American traders was becoming a larger city where immigrants could come and find work. Dutch and German settlers began populating Pittsburgh and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a whole, and coming from places like Hamburg or Nuremberg, these German immigrants almost never pronounced the frontier city as Pittsburgh, and often left off the H when writing it, simply referring to the city as Pittsburgh. These cultural differences in the spelling and pronunciation of town names led to a great amount of confusion across the city and across Pennsylvania. Some newspapers referred to the city as Pittsburgh, and some called it Pittsburgh, and it was often up to the interpretation of the reader and perhaps the cultural heritage of who was writing the name of the city to determine how to spell and pronounce it. This non-standardized spelling of US place names was becoming a problem for record-keeping and census purposes, and in 1890, the U.S. Board on Geographic Names announced that all U.S. settlements ending in burgh or burg were to be officially renamed with a G and not an H on all government records and documents. The Board on Geographic Names cited Pittsburgh's original charter of 1816 without the H as a reasoning for this new rule. But the response to this administrative decision was mixed among the residents of Pittsburgh, or Pittsburgh, I guess. Technically speaking, the new spelling change was only mandatory for federally affiliated organizations, so the first buildings in Pittsburgh to even see the H disappear were things like post offices and federal buildings. A lot of newspapers, universities, and even the city stock exchange still use the H in their signage, branding, and day-to-day operations. And for the next decade or so, it would appear as if the usage of H at the end of Pittsburgh became even more divisive, as a lot of government and public buildings didn't include the letter, but private businesses almost always did unless they were owned by somebody who spoke German. By 1908, the Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce, after spending years analyzing historical records and documents of the city, most of which predated the American Revolution, announced that the H was indeed a necessary historical part of Pittsburgh, both in its spelling and in its heritage. The Chamber of Commerce was able to put pressure on elected officials both in the state and federal governments, and by 1911, Pittsburgh's H was officially restored. Most of the newspapers and local businesses that had temporarily dropped the letter had fully restored it by the time the 1920s rolled around. But the temporary removal of the H definitely had its consequences across the city. First, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone today who calls the city Pittsburgh, even if that's the reason the H is there in the first place. Second, there's a good chance you'll still find references to the missing H all over town, in old buildings like train stations, post offices, or old federal buildings. Even today, the spelling of Pittsburgh is confusing for a lot of Americans, especially if you're not from here. It remains one of the few towns or cities pronounced burg that ends in an H. But in reality, the extra letter in the city's name is really just a nod to its history. Being founded by a Scotsman, but slowly populated by immigrants from all over the place, the city's name and pronunciation slowly morphed into the spelling not really needing the H at all. I hope you enjoyed this video, just some short local history for you guys today, but I'd like to thank you for all the support you've been showing us on our recent videos, especially the newest installment of Pittsburgh's Abandoned Neighborhoods. It really does mean a lot. If you have any more suggestions for videos or any questions you'd love to see answered, just drop them in the comments. I've seen a lot of requests for videos exploring the history of Seldom Seen, so if that's something you might be interested in, let us know. As always, there's something new to learn every day, and we're here to help you out. We're those history guys.